Somehow, I have a lot to say about ressentiment. A shocking amount, really. So, hopefully by the end of this video, you will have a solid understanding of Nietzsche's version of the concept, and how Jordan Burnt Peterson got it so terribly wrong. This video made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! Hi. This is the video now. Hello, and welcome back to our reading of the Anti-Ideology Ideologue's Direction for We Mere Mortals to Abandon Our Ideology in Rule 6 of Beyond Order 12 More Rules for Life. Kitty. Oh no. Oh no. Oh no. We left off the previous video with Peterson's warning to beware of intellectuals who make a god out of their ism. A point you'd think he could have just finished the chapter with, but no. Apologies to non-English speakers here, but he's got one more bee in his bonnet to vent his spleen about, so that's where we're picking up today. The so-called hidden motivations behind the isms. These hidden motivations being something that Peterson can somehow sniff out and inform us about because he's that good of a Jungian clinical psychologist. Or something. All of it will hinge on Nietzsche's Ressentiment, which is where we're going to spend most of this video. Most. Huge shout out to everybody who helped me on this script, both for making sure I didn't say something stupid, but also because I'm still a novice when it comes to Nietzsche. I know more than when I started this role, but I'm still a novice, and so what I had originally was going to be off. Not Peterson levels of wrong, but still off, which is no bueno. So thanks to everybody who helped me, hobbyist or professional, it turns out, you're able to get a better sense of ressentiment. So thank you. So let's get those pesky bees out of his toque and get right to it, starting with the quick refresher for the visual cues I use to indicate where ideas are coming from. This means I'm paraphrasing the book, this means I'm responding to the book, or integrating my thoughts with references. There's not really science to be had today, so think of this as the Nietzsche niche, the history hideaway, the Solzhenitsyn space. Yeah, okay, maybe I shouldn't try to get clever with that, so let's just start, shall we? Yeah. We have arrived at Peterson's 8th reference for this chapter. And of course, it is once again Nietzsche. Naturally. Nietzsche-natch. So we are going to start with the source material before seeing Peterson's use of it. With how this is cited, I spent a while looking for what I thought were two books. Had I only looked at the cover, I would have saved myself some time, as they are bound in the same book. By these translators at least. And hello again, Kaufman. Guess you're Peterson's favorite. I have found that Kaufman usually has helpful stuff to say in the editor's introduction, so while reading, I came across his advice. Quote, to understand Nietzsche's conceptions of master and slave morality, one should read Beyond Good and Evil, section 260, and Human, All Too Human, section 45. And keep in mind the title of our book, which deals with the origins of morality. Nietzsche distinguishes moralities that originated in ruling classes from moralities that originated among the oppressed. Yeah, ressentiment is linked to his morality systems. We'll get there. So, I did that recommended reading, and then read the section Peterson pointed us to. It's coming after similar things to what we saw from Nietzsche references earlier this chapter. How the domesticating effects of culture, by way of religion, was bad for the modern man, and how they needed to return to their more pure, natural will to power. And I am grateful to Kaufman for suggesting reading the other things before attempting this one. Peterson is just throwing us into slave morality revolts, so let's backtrack a sec. Basically, Nietzsche categorized moralities into two groups, the master and slave moralities. Masters are the people in charge, the ruling class, the nobility, just the top dogs from the various cultures. Slaves are everyone else. I'm not entirely sure where the middle class would fit into this, although it's a relatively new social strata in the grand scheme of things and also kind of disappearing. So I guess it would probably be more in line with the slave moralities with possible aspirations for the master, but I'm just guessing. The way I'm finding easiest to conceptualize the two morality systems is in how good and bad, or evil, are defined. In master moralities, what is considered good is set by the ruling group. What the nobility value in themselves is good. What is contemptible to them is bad. So they are said to be, quote, value creating, as they themselves determine what is good or bad. Linked to this is reverence for tradition and the ancestors. Shocking that Peterson wasn't referencing Nietzsche in all of his Rule 1 blah blah. Any of his blah blah about the importance of tradition that's been handed down to us by our wise and sage ancestors. In fairness, Nietzsche wasn't really lionizing tradition the way Peterson is, so maybe it's not a good fit for a reference. Although aspects or fragments of Nietzsche's philosophy are pretty pervasive in Peterson's ideology. Like, once you learn to see the signature of it, you can see it everywhere. It's like he's lobster washing Nietzsche, just, oh no, this is the correct interpretation. Ignore everything else that came before. Slave morality is described as a, quote, morality of utility, in the sense that its good things help the underclasses cope with the, quote, pressure of existence. Good in this morality box are things like pity, a warm heart, and friendliness. Specific good things to the masters are, quote, the feeling of fullness, of power that seeks to overthrow, the happiness of high tension, the consciousness of wealth that would give and bestow. It's not said outright in what I've read, but it seems like Nietzsche is talking around or not really interested in addressing the effect that not having the, quote, consciousness of wealth would have on lower class people. It's so great that the noble value creators have the means to go faffing about on their, quote, capacity for and duty of long gratitude and long revenge, and a, quote, certain necessity for having enemies. They certainly have the time to, since they aren't having to worry their pretty little savage heads with putting food on the table or keeping their family housed. Bad things in the slave morality, quote, inspire fear, and as such are evil. So to condense that all down, in master morality, the value holder determines what is good by what they value in themselves, and the bad is their ick. In slave morality, good is determined by what can make their struggle-filled lives easier and kinder, and bad is replaced by evil. Within that evil can contain the master morality's good, as that requires holding power that they never will. And hey, that leaves us with a pretty good segue back to Peterson's reference for Ressentiment. This section, by which I mean a handful of pages, is from Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morals, in which he lays out his view of where our morality systems came from. And we can't even make it a sentence in before we're having to take another detour. Right, so this, quote, slave revolt and morality. What's up with that? Thankfully, we just need to go back a couple pages. This is something that is credited to the Jews a couple thousand years ago. Because we are bordering on Yikesville, let me briefly remind you of the context surrounding Nietzsche talking about Jewish people and the use of Nietzsche's works by the party. We talked about this in a previous part of this chapter. The very quick and dirty version is that, according to Nietzsche spurts like Kaufman, Nietzsche was adamantly anti-Semitic, and the way he talked about the group was relatively progressive for his time. The spread of Nietzsche's works in the Nazi Party was partly a consequence of his sister tweaking his works to appeal to the antecedents of that audience. That said, with what he writes, she didn't have to tweak it all that hard to push the appeal. So in brief, it seems like he wasn't trying to portray Jews negatively, at least not more so than any other religious group like the Christians, which you know he threw down with for domesticating us. And he had far harsher words for Christianity, but seeing as how one group has been a far more vulnerable minority for a good chunk of history, you can see how it doesn't read so well today. Okay, so regarding the morality slave revolt ascribed to Jews, Kaufman's footnote points us to his commentary in Beyond Good and Evil. We are looking at section 195, and it's still looking kind of bad. The footnote here points to a bunch of things Nietzsche wrote, but the main point Kaufman's trying to make in doing so is to show the different ways Nietzsche wrote about Jewish people, and show it wasn't all so questionable. To look at one, in section 52 of Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche called out the audacity of attaching the New Testament to the Old and calling it, quote, the book par excellence, given the New Testament's fluffy tameness compared to the OT's hardcore, quote, divine justice and incomparable grandiosity. Okay, so Nietzsche's point here is that Jewish morality flipped a sort of natural hierarchy of morals. Instead of power and resource accumulation being top good, Jews emphasized, basically, things according to the slave morality, hence the, quote, slave rebellion and morals. In the section after, he expands on how we aren't even aware that this revolt happened because it was that long of a process, which was furthered by Jesus. That Christianity offered too tempting a promise to the masses, so the slave morality was able to, quote, triumph over all nobler ideals. Also, importantly for what's coming, that this was a, quote, spiritual revenge, born out of, quote, vengefulness and hatred. Because why else would people possibly want to focus on camaraderie over conquest? He continues to argue that this revolt is kinda over. Slave morality won, so what purpose does the church have now? Especially as it, quote, alienates more than seduces at this point. That we could be, quote, free spirits without the church. So this free spirits comment, unsurprisingly, ties into one of the themes of Nietzsche's works. That we could go beyond the good and evil ways of doing morality, elevating ourselves beyond what's come before. That the old ways had essentially been killed by modernity, and so we needed to either become free spirits or fall into nihilism. Look at that title. Isn't that interesting? An author who can deliver on the beyondness that the book title's promising. Something we haven't really seen from Peterson. And with that, I think we can finally really start the section Peterson referenced. This has been so much Nietzsche for this poor little philosophy noob who didn't even take like Philosophy 101. So if you found this edutaining, please leave a like, subscribe perhaps. I was not made for this kind of reading. The impetus for the morality revolt is ressentiment, which in the footnote is translated just as resentment. But why specifically use a French term? Kaufman has some insight for us. 1, there isn't an equivalent in German, sort of like how Schadenfreude has worked its way into English. 2, after Nietzsche's falling out with Wagner. Yes, that Wagner, so important to the obviously, the thing to do would be to embrace the culture and language Wagner hated. We're spending a little extra time here because I feel like Kaufman managed to reach through time to roast Dr. P while having a little aside about Hegel trying to localize philosophy into German. Quote, nothing serves as well as obscurity to make shallowness look profound.
Nice.
So, Nietzsche was against nationalism and also wanted to be precise and efficient in his writing. So if there was a good word to use, even if it's not German, he'd use it. However, Nietzsche did like one form of ambiguity that I kind of feel like Peterson has made his brand, so-called revaluation, which is amusingly a revaluation of revaluate itself. Quoting Kaufman, he loved words and phrases that mean one thing out of context and almost its opposite in the context he gives them. All of them involve a double meaning, one exoteric, or readily understood, and one esoteric, one, to put it crudely, wrong, and the other right. However, contrary to what may have been Nietzsche's intent, to trip up skimmers, it seems like Peterson does it because he wants to change the meaning of the word. A sort of definitional
Truthiness.
Anyways, back on point. The third reason for why French, especially in an English translation, is that this was a Nietzscheanism. This is a major thing he contributed, so calling it anything else would obscure the full intended meaning. Getting back to Peterson's reference, ressentiment comes from the perception of existing in a hostile world and reacting by calling it all evil. This is, of course, a problem for the morality of the commoners, because the noble breed's values are created by virtue of what they value in themselves. Also, when viewing those beneath them to formulate their bad with contempt, as is their right, the masters don't twist reality as much as their inferiors do, because contempt is less toxic than the, quote, submerged hatred, the vengefulness of the impotent, characteristic of slave morality. Also, morality MasterCard holders are able to genuinely be happy, as opposed to those who aren't handed life on a platter. No, they have to, quote, deceive themselves that they were happy. The masters are also, quote, necessarily active, which helps them be happy, while the slaves are passive, which further ruins their happy vibes. Hey Nietzsche, why might the lower classes have needed to rest more? Could it be that they were having to do more labor than their social betters? And actual back-breaking labor? Not dicking around with a sticky wicket and having a good war or whatever those fancy coxcombs did. Nietzsche keeps on with the poor people be like herder for a bit, noting along the way that if a noble person should happen to be struck with ressentiment, it'll pass quickly because, ew, poor people. That is a manner most unbecoming for someone of distinction. Being able to let shit slide off you like water off a duck's back is a noble trait indicative of a strong nature. And actually, a master loves their enemies, because it says something good about them to have such good enemies. Keeps them sharp. Meanwhile, the, quote, evil enemy of the lower born is crafted out of ressentiment, and then informs their definition of good by exclusion. Continuing beyond the part Peterson referenced, Nietzsche lays out differences between good, bad, and evil pretty clearly. In a master morality, good comes from within themselves, and bad is crafted from their disdain. They are the masters of their universe. In slave morality, stricken with ressentiment, evil is the good from the master morality, passed through the, quote, venomous eye of ressentiment. Good, then, is just not that. And we are skipping the, quote, blonde beast bit because that is way above my pay grade. Okie doke. With that citation pre-addressed, let's see what use Peterson makes of all of that.
Ressentiment, hostile resentment, occurs when individual failure or insufficient status is blamed both on the system within which that failure or lowly status occurs, and then, most particularly, on the people who have achieved success and high status within that system.
That kinda almost tracks, albeit less so the more that I look at it. Like, shorthanding it as, quote, hostile resentment is shortchanging Nietzsche's complexity that we skimmed the surface of in this video. Regardless, Peterson has stripped away the bigger context of the two morality systems, which just... Really, Dr. P? You love putting things in two boxes. Come here, Peterson, come here. You can tell me. Do you not want to show others doing this? Are you afraid that people won't like you as much if they find out that other people can put things into two boxes? It's fine, don't worry about it. I'm sure this won't change anybody's opinion of you. Okay, so when he talked about ressentiment and 12 rules, and yes, this is the ressentiment hand gesture, I don't make the rules. So when he talked about ressentiment and 12 rules, it was also divorced from the morality system development context. Hell, it was even more divorced from ressentiment itself. In Rule 11, he dropped Nietzsche in after his favorite depth psychologist to illustrate the true unconscious motives behind progressive attempts at improving things, by using the quote about the tarantulas. His referencing there lets us know he pulled this from Kaufman's Portable Nietzsche. But to be pedantic, and you can also be pedantic in the swag from my merch store, check it out, link below, this was originally from Thus Spake Zarathustra, which we touched on in part 2 of this rule. These tarantulas have a will to equity, which you know both Nietzsche and Peterson cannot abide, which was argued to come not from a place of trying to better everyone's lives, but rather as a way to, quote, wreak vengeance and abuse on their social betters. Now, having done the reading on Nietzsche's morality systems, I can see how this tarantula heart business is representing the slave morality system, just in a more poetic form. Interestingly, Peterson didn't expand much on it then. He just immediately moved on to misrepresenting Orwell's views on socialism. There are a couple points of Peterson's explanation of ressentiment we need to get into because they're off. We're going to start with a relatively easy one, in that Peterson stripped ressentiment of its social class context, which struck me as a choice. I tried to see if I was off base here, so turned to trusty old Wikipedia for some help. Seems like it may have partially shifted into a psychodynamic view, which, great, love that. Not that the editor could provide a reference for that claim. But Peterson's referencing ressentiment at its source with Nietzsche. If he's using the more modern class non-specific version, that should have been clarified both in text at some point and with a reference that touches on the shift. Without that, yeah, he's definitely missing important context here. Always a great thing to do when building an entire section of your life advice book on a concept. Just revaluate it into what you want it to be. No. A major source of offness is the centrality of blame in Peterson's description of ressentiment. He's basically given us a series of events here. Person is at the bottom or fails. Person blames this on the system they are bottoming or failing in. Then, quote, most particularly, the person blames the successful tops. And keep in mind, dear viewer, that this is all being attributed to a specific portion of Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morals. So let's have a look-see back through that section and see if we can find Peterson's blame in here. Slave morality revolt because of ressentiment birthed values, reiteration of the differences between master and slave moralities, adding that slave morality needs to exist in a world felt to be hostile and reactively reject it, master morality values differently, differences in how the two moralities misperceive the world, some stuff about Greek language indicating stuff between the higher and lower classes, which shifts to a discussion on happiness and activity levels between the two groups. More differences between the groups, now about how honest they are with themselves, and how the dishonesty of ressentiment leads to craftiness. The thing about ressentiment not being a thing for the masters, how not holding grudges or ruminating on mistakes is a sign of nobility, the differences in the feelings about enemies, and finally, the enemy for ressentiment people being an evil contrivance, which then informs their sense of goodness. There's no blame here. Maybe it's hiding somewhere in Kaufman's recommended reading to understand the morality systems. In section 260 of Beyond Good and Evil, there's noted suspicion on the part of the lower class for what the masters call good, and the evil label being assigned to those who inspire fear, and what's good for the slave morality leading to overall increased stupidity. No blame though. Section 45 of Human, All Too Human has a slightly different genealogy of morals, with the good tribe being able to, quote, practice requital against good and evil, and those who can't quite requite right belong to the bad swarm. There's a little bit on the differences between bad and evil. Goodness is apparently inherited as, quote, it is impossible that a bad man could grow up out of such good soil. Okay, and more differences between the good and bad people. Still no blame. There's one last place I can think of to look, and it's a bit of a Hail Mary on behalf of Peterson. We are returning to the tarantula hearts from Thus Spake Zarathustra. The tarantula wants revenge for itself, and to spread the need for it. Zarathustra, the sort of narrator in this book, wants people to be free from the cycle. Getting to the little part Peterson quoted in 12 Rules, the tarantulas want equity, but the method to achieve it is by getting revenge against their betters. Zarathustra calls the tarantulas out on their hidden tyrannical drives. Revenge, a warning from Big Z about those, quote, who talk too much of their justice, because they are unpowered tyrants. Hidden revenge, Z's against equality and that's a good thing to him. Fighting as a consequence of inequality, life needs to have inequality, let's have good fights as good enemies. But oh no, Z got bit by the tarantula, knocking the wind out of Z's sails and filling him with the need for vengeance, so he wants his students to tie him up to prevent him, quote, dancing the tarantella. Right, so there is a distinct lack of blame in any of the things he's directly or indirectly pointed us to for ressentiment, particularly from his citation for it, that he's presumably building his explanation on. What do we do with this information? Well, this wouldn't be the first time Peterson's taken a source out of context or misconstrued the point of what he's citing. It's just wild to see it for something that he's painted himself to be an expert on. Like him getting marks wrong? That's easy enough for the lobsters to just, it's fine. He's not an expert on marks. He's never claimed to be. It's not a core part of his advice, so it's fine. It's fine. But Nietzsche? Ressentiment? Homeboy fucked up on his own surf and turf, at least according to him. I will mention here that the very generous with their time Grantor the academic, philosopher no less, pointed me in the direction of where to find an element of blame in Nietzsche's Ressentiment. However, it ties in basically perfectly with where we're going to pick things up in the next video, so we're going to hold off until then. But it's not along the lines of what Peterson described, so my point still stands. I think the thing that's really a sticking point for me on this is that it's adding, I don't know quite how to say it, a degree of interaction between the tops and bottoms, since we're apparently shifting away from masters and slaves. The bottoms are blaming the tops for their topness, as opposed to the general sense I got from Nietzsche's works that was more detached than that. The tops look down at the bottoms with contempt, and the bottoms look up at the tops with fearful suspicion. And that's just how it is. Well, it's laying the groundwork for why he's even talking about ressentiment in the first place, unfortunately. However, Peterson's revaluating of Nietzsche's ressentiment doesn't stop there. In addition to blame, Peterson adds a failure layer onto what I'm assuming is the lower class status from Nietzsche. Yeah, that helps to modernize it, especially in the bootstrapping capitalist hellscape we call society at this point, where if you're lower class, it's only because you haven't capitalismed hard enough to not be. But again, it bugs me with how this is written. It seems like it's part of Nietzsche's usage of ressentiment, which it wasn't, at least not as far as I could tell. And then there's also this system that the ressentimenting is happening in. That certainly wasn't part of what we dug through back there. I suppose you could do a sort of ass-pull to justify Pearson's edition of this as just expanding what Nietzsche was talking about. That it was implied in Nietzsche's writings that the tops and the bottoms all existed in the same system. He just never mentioned it or talked about it because reasons. Building on that, it's an interesting choice to specify that blame is eventually placed on the people who have both, quote, achieved success and high status within that system. So if someone who has failed is ressentimenting at someone who has succeeded but has not achieved high
status,
that'd be okay? Or would that not be ressentiment in this case? You gotta be careful with those ands, Peterson. The pedantic patrol will come for your imprecise speech. My issue with Peterson expanding ressentiment like this is that it seems like this places blame, a different blame than the one Peterson added, on the person who isn't high status or succeeding, whatever that actually means in this case, instead of possibly considering that the person has legitimate grievances with the system, situation, and or people up top. Why shouldn't the lower classes be pissed off at the elites for having inherited a relatively easier life? Why is their master morality system the more noble one? Because they were born into privilege? Fuck that. While I do agree that centering your life on resentment isn't healthy, my working class roots bristle at the implication that if I work super duper hard, I can advance myself into that master morality mindset, which will be to my benefit. No, I do not think it better to be a predator preying on those I now view as contemptible. And no, this wasn't the natural order of things before Judaism either. The amusing part here is Peterson's not going to follow through with this. He's not going to encourage readers to develop out of that slave morality system into the master morality system or dare to dream, one free of either. Possibly because that could run the risk of people figuring out that they are value creators. And hey, they value things that go against the traditional value set. And we can't have that happening. No. Peterson explains the ressentiment causal chain of thought. The system itself is deemed unjust, quote, by fiat. By fiat, huh? I am curious what authority Peterson thinks is making this decree, especially with some ability to enforce it. I suppose he'd argue it's the progressives who are decaying the West with their DEI initiatives and pronouns and threatening to revoke his professional standing for being a hateful piece of shit. The authoritarian bastards who weren't exactly around in Nietzsche's time. In this unjust system, the winners are, quote, exploitative and corrupt, and didn't earn their winningness. Therefore, it is, quote, morally justified to attack the winners. Peterson makes the blanket statement of this thought chain being the consequence of shameful envy, with an implication that it's no longer viewed negatively. With the structure of this paragraph, my assumption would be that this is all coming from reference 8. On the off chance you've forgotten, dear viewer, that was Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morals, pages 36 to 39. And as shown while trying to find blame in there, none of what Peterson described for this causal chain of thought is in what he cited, or in the pages surrounding that, or in the little chunk of Beyond Good and Evil Kaufman pointed to as being relevant for Ressentiment. Really, the closest we come to this idea, that the winners must be attacked by the losers, is the part of Thus Spake Zarathustra Peterson quoted in 12 Rules, the tarantula heart thing and their need for revenge. But that is a huge stretch. Now he, or his lobster army, could try to dismiss his criticism by saying that obviously this is his addition to Nietzsche's Ressentiment. All of it, really, besides the loanword from French. But I'm going to put my foot down and say, The division between what is cited for Nietzsche's Ressentiment and his creative extension of the arguments is not clear at all, and that is a part of bad source handling. It should be crystal clear where ideas are coming from, in both directions. Right now, this seems to be trying to pump up some extra authority by implying it was from a celebrated philosopher, rather than an infamous psychologist. Now, to actually respond a little to what Peterson wrote there, I actually kind of think there's two sides to consider with this. Two sides. Different than two boxes. Absolutely, there's a side Peterson's talking about. Someone feeling burned by the thing that they tried and failed at, who now wants to burn everything down. Resenting the people who didn't fail. And I agree that mindset is not healthy. It just leaves you spinning your wheels and stagnating instead of taking the opportunity for growth that you kind of have to. But I see another side to this, because I've lived it. While I enjoy what's become my job, it isn't exactly what I thought I'd be doing. I am an academic brown dwarf. For a couple interacting reasons, I never cracked into a faculty job. I have since made my peace with it, as much as I can. But there were many feelings, some of them pretty negative, in the process of realizing I wasn't going to get to fulfill my long-term dream of being a professor, and no laughing at that dream. That is a lofty position to a working class kid. And yeah, there can still be resentment at the institution that I failed to find my place in. Although most of it is directed at my original advisor and his orbiters, but I digress. But by not having made it, I was offered an opportunity to really see the cracks in the ivory facade that, honestly, I wouldn't have had to think about had I had landed a tenure-track job. Because if you are able to succeed in a system, unless you listen to the critics and really value what they have to say, there is zero incentive for you to try to change it for the better. If anything, it can feel like there's some incentive to close the door behind you to reduce competition, especially in academia. And people don't even have to be conscious they're doing this, the winning and the door closing, because it cheapens the win if you realize that you benefited from a rigged system. So just put those thoughts out of your head to preserve your feelings. No matter the costs, as long as you made it. Basically, it's the job version of fuck you, got mine. Peterson's all about confronting the monster and evil within, as you'll see in the next video, but yet, somehow he will not or cannot do this sort of introspection and self-reflection. In case you weren't aware somehow, he is a straight white guy. He was dealt a pretty good hand for the mid-20th century Canada. And yeah, he's worked a variety of jobs, some of them labor, including the one he got nicknamed Howdy Doody at, but he's always done it from a relative position of privilege. A position I doubt he's thought about much, given how fiercely against DEI measures he is. If anything, he seems to only have really thought about the negative impacts members of his in-group's experience, such as the very true statistic he talked about in 12 Rules, Rule 11, the Let Kids Skateboard one, about education systems failing boys and men. Don't go messing with the status quo now. Not if it messes with the traditional ways of doing things and you aren't a creative conservative. Basically, my point is that growth can come from processing through ressentiment, both on a personal local level, where you try to improve on the things that led to you failing, as well as on a larger scale. Maybe you didn't win or succeed or whatever because the system was unfair. Yeah, you can seethe and ruminate on it, or you can try to make something positive happen from this. Could just be to take the invitation to find a different path or a system that isn't so rigged against you, or you could champion for reform in that broken system. The choice is yours.
There is another typical feature of ideological pursuit. The victims supported by ideologues are always innocent, and it is sometimes true that victims are innocent, and the perpetrators are always evil. Evil perpetrators are also not in short supply. But the fact that there exist genuine victims and perpetrators provides no excuse to make low-resolution blanket statements about the global locale of blameless victimization and evil perpetration, particularly of the type that does not take the presumed innocence of the accused firmly into account.
I'm not sure if he's saying evil here as a nod to Nietzsche's slave morality and its good versus evil dichotomy, or if he's just using it in the more common sense as the opposite of good. With how sloppy his writing can be, I've shifted to just assuming it's probably not intentional. Although it is possible he accidentally fell onto doing it. I say this because he's avoided talking about the master-slave morality systems like something he'd avoid harder than the modern plague, so it may not be in his thoughts while he wrote this. I wouldn't be surprised if he either just knew or looked up where Nietzsche talked about ressentiment and dropped that in as a reference without rereading it. But really, if he had went more into the morality systems, this innocent victim versus evil perpetrator part would have mapped onto the slave morality bins. But the thing is, in what I've seen, it seems like progressives have a greater propensity towards seeing the factors that help set the path the perpetrator ended up on. So it isn't just that the offender did the bad thing because they're evil, although, as Peterson mentioned, sometimes there are exceptions and people just suck. There were likely factors in their early development, failures in the school system, all the way up to systemic cultural issues that made the offender's behavior seem more acceptable to them, as was the case with convicted Brock Turner. These non-specific ideologies he's talking about would do two things, in my estimation. Second, and we're working backwards, you'll see why. As I just said, there would be a look at the broader context the offender was operating in to see what systemic issues or failures led them to this point, with the intent of initiating changes to those systems to prevent this happening in the future. First, believe the victim. And also, importantly, not require them to be a perfect or stereotypical victim. I'm not entirely sure where he's getting this idea that the progressive perception is that the victim is always innocent, whatever that means. Wouldn't you know it, the perfect example leapt to mind while I was writing this. Something from 12 Rules that will inform this quite a bit, and this is where the content warning kicks in. So, we are jumping back to Rule 9. Assume that the person you are listening to might know something you don't. To his story about a former client. This client had been seeing him for a bit, but then, in one appointment, told him that she thought she had been raped. At hearing this, the place Peterson's mind went to was to wonder how drunk she was when it happened. But then the client added it happened repeatedly, which Peterson couldn't understand. He proceeds to describe this client to us as a, quote, ghost of a person who was desperate for attention and couldn't think for herself. To really make sure we understand his perspective of this former client and make sure we don't end up sympathizing too much with her, he added info about the difficulty she was having and seeing him for. That he believed she needed someone to tell her about herself and who she was because she couldn't do it herself. He walked us through the thoughts he had about her in response to what she had said, that all have an unprofessionally judgmental and paternalistic tone. He saw two alternate paths he could take in responding to her. The, quote, left-wing social justice response would be to validate her feelings and affirm that she had been raped. The conservative response would have asked her, quote, what the hell she expected getting drunk while going to, quote, singles bars, implying it was her fault. He went with neither, instead asking her what she thought and then listening, without seeming to help her work through to actually help her understand what had happened. Partly because she was seeing a Jungian-based therapist and that process is never quick, but also because, in his mind, the question of whether or not she had been raped is a complex one, and he didn't want her leaving therapy as, quote, the living embodiment of my damned ideology. There's a lot to unpack there. But for starters, if this article by Cowan and others is anything to go by for how therapists should respond to these sorts of situations, Peterson really dropped the friggin' ball here. Even as a psychodynamic practitioner, he should have helped her process that experience with a hell of a lot more than just listening to her. The example in the Cowan paper includes a series of prompts by the therapist helping a hypothetical client work through their feelings about what happened. The reason this came to mind was his caricature of what a, quote, social justice response would be that culminates in telling her, quote, she was an innocent victim. Even if she was getting blackout drunk on the regular and engaging in risky behaviors, which it is not at all clear she was, that was a fucking assumption on his part. Right now is not the time to work with her on that. She seemed to be coming to him as her therapist for help in figuring out and processing what happened, which, I'm guessing, a bunch of listening didn't do much to help with. While I am relieved that he just listened and didn't unload his conservative takes on her, this sheds light on how he thinks things go in social justice circles, as well as some of his own internal thoughts on victims. That the, quote, left-leaning answer would have gone all in. That her uncertainty was reflective of, quote, thorough and long-term victimization, as opposed to not being sure where the boundaries between consensual and non-consensual sex are. And I'm imagining Canada does about as well as the US does in teaching young adults that, so yeah, having some uncertainty there is sadly unsurprising. That he's playing it up is ridiculous for people engaging in sex to make sure their partner is an eager participant is concerning, which is followed by a debate bro-esque absurdity play about each move needing to be consented to, which, yeah, Peterson, they do. This is easier with long-term partners, knowing what is and isn't okay, but even then, you need to check in periodically and make sure that things are still wanted and everything's okay. It's basic carnal courtesy. She doesn't have to have been innocent to have been raped, dipshit. But there's also all that stuff he shared that went through his head. That she must have been drunk, because drunk people, quote, get raped. But you know, she was vague and naive. Quote, anyone could take her by the hand and guide her down the road of their choosing. It was just waiting to happen. So really, it seems to be that to him, the question is how much she did, what she was unconsciously wanting. She can tell I'm angry. It's like he thinks that spinning up these narratives in his head and then just listening to her is the better option than working with her to help her figure out what happened and process through her feelings. Which to me seems like he can't believe that she was the victim of repeated sexual assaults. That he's having to poke holes in her credibility in his head to, I don't know, justify fucking just sitting there listening to her and not helping her as her fucking therapist. He's talking here about the innocence of victims being an assumption of ideologues, but come on. At least with this client, he did the exact opposite. Presume her guilt in things, which, conveniently enough, makes the offender an innocent bystander who made the mistake of getting intimate with her. Which is sort of why there has been this push to believe victims in progressive spaces. If an assault case goes to trial, the victim's life is going to be put under a microscope in cross-examination to try to ruin their credibility as a victim, to make it seem like they were asking for what happened, that they should have expected the assault, as described in this conversation piece by Iliads and Braun. A person who is assaulted is someone who has had their personal rights attacked by another person. It shouldn't matter what their sexual or substance use history is. But I'm probably preaching to the choir on this channel, so we'll move on. Another disconnect Peterson seems to have from how progressive spaces tend to work is the importance of a person's agency in things. From what I've seen, a person's agency and their choices, actions, and attendant consequences of those is so important. A person has to be free to live their life, as long as it doesn't impinge on the rights of others. But with what Peterson's describing here, agency is removed for everyone. An offender being evil suggests that they didn't really have a choice. They were going to offend because they're evil. Choice has been implicitly removed from the equation. If Peterson had provided any sort of example for things, rather than, quote, low-resolution blanket statements, we might have a more clear idea of what he's trying to talk about here. But he hasn't. That I got lucky with the neuron firing at the right moment provided the only sort of lobster context I could think of for this. But it is possible I'm off base. That he isn't talking about assault cases at all. So then, is this about people critical of the patriarchal system, with the offenders being all men? Or is this about environmentalists putting everyone on blast for existing? What is it, Peterson? Gimme specifics. More broadly speaking, the good and evil dichotomy Peterson claims are inherent in isms seems to be a more apt description of how he sees the world, at least regarding things he doesn't like, such as all the isms this chapter can sometimes be about, like proponents of DEI measures, affirming care providers for trans and or non-binary people, or climate change fighters, to name just a few. The last thing I want to touch on here is something I've also seen in online spaces, a general misconception about the necessity of, quote, presuming the innocence of the accused. It gets thrown around, like when someone breaks a Discord server's rules or on pre-Muskie Twitter, that someone shouldn't be penalized until they've been given a fair trial, that their guilt has been presumed, and this is a free country, my rights, blah, blah, blah. So, thing is, that is a requirement for criminal proceedings. You know, when somebody's been charged with a crime that they could be penalized for in the penal system, so it's really important that they get a fair trial where their jury isn't biased against them. If you are unclear on this, Wikipedia can go into more detail. Civil cases have a lower burden of proof, as described in the Cornell Law School link, wherever it is. So it doesn't have that same presumption of innocence. And when you get to the court of public opinion, hey, guess what? There is no standard burden of proof. None. In the unspoken social contract, one would hope that they aren't presumed to be guilty of things until there is a preponderance of receipts shared, but nah, no one owes you that, for better or worse. And whilst possible Peterson is talking about criminal level offenses here, I doubt it. He's probably talking about the more mundane day-to-day judgments, so the presumption of innocence would be a courtesy from an informational vacuum. Muddying the discussion by demanding a presumption of innocence of every single person who has benefited from dysfunctional power structures is a waste of fucking time, and seems to largely be done by people who are actively part of the problem. I could say more here, but he's actually going somewhere with this point. In a moment of peak hypocrisy, he basically just said, don't assume evil. But then he's gonna turn around and assume some evil in the following sentence.
No group guilt should be assumed, and certainly not of the multi-generational kind. It is a certain sign of the accuser's evil intent and a harbinger of social catastrophe. But the advantage is that the ideologue, at little practical costs, can construe him or herself both as nemesis of the oppressor and defender of the oppressed. Who needs the fine distinctions that determination of individual guilt or innocence demands when a prize such as that beckons?
See what I mean? Quote, it is a certain sign of the accuser's evil intent to assume group guilt. He never has been good at following his own advice, unless he really thinks of himself as Peterson, true knower of everybody's inner thoughts and selves, which I wouldn't find surprising with all the Jung he's huffed over the years. Reference, or rather endnote 9, is a comment about the punishment the families of, quote, class enemies experienced in the USSR and Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, specifically the version that has the foreword by Peterson. Of course, he'd have the foreword on the abridged version. We aren't going to spend much time here, other than for me to opine that Peterson's point would have been better supported with something that isn't known to be, let's call it, historically hyperbolic with regard to the facts. Dig through the citations in the linked Wikipedia section on the academic response to the Gulag Archipelago for more there. What exactly does Peterson mean by group guilt here? The Solzhenitsyn citation is a specific example, but the text seems to be written more generally. One might even call it overly general. That in its vagueness, it's feeding into the conservative culture war discourse that claims all white people are painted as evil, or all men, or all whatever. If you actually look into what's being said in progressive circles, it's not that clear cut, and certainly not seriously throwing around the evil label. Then this rapid upscaling, particularly with the emphasis it receives, is surprising, and not the fun kind of surprise. In the quote before, it seemed like he was talking about an individual person's presumed innocence or guilt, but then bam, now we're talking about group guilt. But then bam again, we've got a singular oppressor, so back to an individual again. Maybe? Certainly by the end of the quote with the, quote, determination of individual guilt or innocence. Pick a scale, bro! As we talked about before though, this presumption of innocence is only really a thing for criminal cases. And yeah, that didn't happen for the families of traitors in the USSR, but in his opinion, where is this happening right now? I'm sure we can all hazard guesses as to what he's talking about here. There's no shortage of possible answers. But again, with how vague this is, it's next to impossible to know what he's actually talking about. If you can predict and explain everything with your model because it's written this broadly, your model's actually shit.
There's no such thing as climate, right? Climate and everything are the same word.
But of course, he had to work in some doom here with the, quote, harbinger of social catastrophe. What is the social catastrophe here? From the citation, it would seem gulags for political prisoners, but is that what he's really warring against now? No, I suspect it to be more about protecting the targets of the isms he's against. From earlier this chapter, some of the isms were against the rich, or more broadly, power. You know how much he loves those dominance hierarchies, in all their forms. Those must be preserved at any cost. At least until a creative conservative comes along with some tradition-honoring ways to restructure things. I think I've talked enough for this video. Yeah. So hopefully you have a pretty good understanding of Ressentiment now, because next time we're going to pick up with his predictions for what happens when you walk the path of Ressentiment. The Rue de Ressentiment, if you will. Until next time, bye.